Good evening all and welcome. Before we start tonight's horrors, just have a quick announcement. Some of you have asked about the birthday shout-out. I'm doing that for anyone who's subscribed to any tier on Patreon. So if you want your birthday shout-out and to be able to pick the topic on your birthday, find the link in the description. But for now, it's time to get comfortable and let the ghosts take control. When I was a child, we lived in a single-family home in Dayton, Kentucky, just across the river from Cincinnati, Ohio. In the late 1980s, my dad constructed a huge, built-in bookcase in our living room. The only problem was my mum mostly had paperback books, which didn't have quite the classic look they were going for. When our mum mentioned this to her boss, who happened to own a rental house across the street from our home, he offered a solution. The previous tenant had abandoned boxes of old books in a creaky second-floor room. Beautiful bound leather and hardback volumes of various sizes, all quite old. The kind of books that many people still value today for their patina and aesthetic appeal. No one knew why the previous tenant left them behind, but her box offered them to us for free so long as my dad collected them. So my dad happily carried box after box of dusty tomes across the street, giving my parents the look they desired. Naturally curious about these new books, one night my dad took one up to my parents' second-floor bedroom to read before his night shift. Opening it, he noticed a stamp in the corner indicating it came from an occult library in Cincinnati. Many books were from there, while others were from the University of Kentucky, seemingly checked out but never returned or stolen. He recalls the book was titled something like The Secrets of Solomon and contained instructions for summoning spirits, angels, and demons. As he sat on his bed reading the incantations, he noticed they had an almost hypnotic rhythm. Suddenly, he was jolted by a loud bang. There were 3 sharp raps against the exterior window. He jumped over the window and parted the blinds and looked around, but didn't see anything. Maybe it was a bird. No, it's nighttime. Birds don't just fly around at night. Besides, if a bird or bat hit the window, there would be a single thud, not 3 precise knocks. Returning to bed later, he went back to reading his book, as its contents fascinated him. About 5 minutes later, 3 bangs again. Startled, he bolted down the stairs and out onto the back deck. His eyes scanned the side of the house and the shadows in our yard. There was absolutely no one in sight, no ladder up the window, just the thick, humid night air, the dimly lit windows of surrounding homes, and the steady hum of crickets. Heart still pounding, he decided the books had to go. He threw all of them into a large black garbage bag and left them out on the curb for the next morning's collection. Now, if this were a creepypasta, the books would have been magically returned to the bookcase through some unseen demonic hand. But that didn't happen. The books were taken away in the morning and he never saw them again. He secretly feared, however, that he may have unintentionally invited something into our home. Later down the line, I woke up one November morning for elementary school. The top of the stairs was just outside my second-floor bedroom, and to my left, the only bathroom in our house. I stepped out of my room to start my morning routine, but noticed someone coming up the stairs. It was a girl around my sister's age, maybe 14. My sister was a cheerleader, and her friends often hung out at our house, sometimes even visiting early in the morning, so this itself wasn't a shock. But I didn't recognize this girl. She had her left hand on the railing and was looking down as her feet climbed the stairs until she realized I was standing there. As soon as our eyes met, she immediately stopped. For a moment we just stared at each other. Then without a word or flicker of emotion, she turned and walked back down the stairs. Well, that was weird, I thought, and went into the bathroom to brush my teeth. When we were getting ready to leave for school together, I asked my sister where her friend was. She replied that no one had come over that morning. I was confused. Then who did I see? Did someone just walk into our house and then leave? I didn't pay attention to how the girl was dressed, as I was a boy and couldn't have cared less about female fashion. Maybe one of my sister's friends showed up, saw her weird little brother in his tighty-whities and noped out. Maybe. Maybe not. The bottom of the stairs was where the kitchen and living room met. One evening my mother was in the kitchen and saw a blonde girl pass by the doorway, as if she had just come down the stairs. My mom was surprised because she didn't know my sister had a friend over. When she walked into our living room to see who it was, the room was empty. Another evening I was home alone, and like many children I felt scared when I was left alone at night. I turned on every light and had music playing to ease my fears, as this was years before I learned to let the darkness take control. Needing to use the bathroom, I gingerly climbed the staircase, every step feeling further from safety of the loud and brightly lit living room. I was afraid to close the bathroom door, almost like I would be trapped inside if something showed itself, so I left it wide open in case I needed to run. This was a very small bathroom, and I was standing in front of the sink's mirror, which reflected a view of the top of the stairs. Suddenly, in the blink of an eye, a shadow flew by the door and down the stairs. It looked like a fuzzy, black basketball, not fuzzy with hair, but the edges were indistinct, undefined and shapeless. Surprisingly, I wasn't terrified but shocked, if not intrigued, as I was a kid who lived for unsolved mysteries. I stepped outside and looked around but saw nothing. No moth or shadow, nothing that could explain what I had just seen. Remember the house across the street where my dad found the occult books? Eventually, that house was occupied by a friend of my mother's, a local policeman who, despite his status as a person of the law, obsessively made illegal copies of rented VHS tapes. He had stacks upon stacks of pirated movies towering around his living room, each labeled by hand. With hundreds of tapes, we could save $1 or $2 on new releases by borrowing his copies. Now, that house always gave me the creeps, but the police officer had a son called Brandon who was around my age. When I was around 10, living directly across the street from Brandon, we became friends. And like most young boys in a relatively poor town, it was cool to be mischievous. "If you dial 666, you can talk to the devil," Brandon told me one summer's day. I was incredulous, as even my child brain knew that sounded absurd. We decided to test the claim, but I told him there was no way we were calling the devil from my house. My parents would be furious. Who knew how expensive such a long-distance call could be? Brandon, always more the rebel, said we could use his parents' phone because no one was home. This was back when everyone had landlines, so he stood in the kitchen where the only telephone was corded to the wall. I stood by his side door, ready to make a swift exit if a goat man or red spandex appeared. Between us, but far out of reach, was their TV, with the stacks of pirated VHS tapes. Brandon took the phone off the wall and we looked at each other. I became increasingly more nervous. It was the middle of the day, and the sun was shining bright in the house, and the air was still. As soon as he pressed the third 6, dozens of VHS tapes toppled to the floor, crashing to the TV as if pushed by an unseen hand. Without any concern for the well-being of my friend, I bolted straight home. Moments later, Brandon appeared at my door. If he had been playing a trick on me, he would have been like, "Ha ha, I got you," or "told all the kids in our block how I scared you." But that never happened. He was as confused as I was, and we never found an explanation other than it being a very specifically weird coincidence. Years later, around 2015, police discovered a body buried in that very basement. A 55-year-old former Air Force man had died in the home. Someone had dug a hole in the basement floor and placed his body in the earth and poured concrete over him. His caretaker continued to use his credit cards and draw from his military pension while he was dead. The autopsy couldn't determine the cause of death, so there wasn't enough evidence to charge anyone with murder, though she pleaded guilty to fraud. It was unclear if she was ever charged with abuse of a corpse, although several people were reportedly living in the house with her. This was the same house where my dad found those occult books, and where my friend and I attempted to call the devil. The man was buried in the basement after our time there, but I think it's still worth noting, as we always felt something being very off with that house. When I was around 13, we moved into a new home in the neighboring town of Bellevue. This was a beautiful brick home with a turret slate roof and hardwood floors. For a time, nothing happened after we moved in. One night while home alone, my dad noticed the kitchen light had inexplicably turned on. He went into the kitchen and switched it off, assuming there must be a short in the switch, then returned to his spot in the living room. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw the kitchen light come on again. When he inspected the switch this time, he saw it had been physically pushed back up, as if someone had turned it on. That's when he began to suspect we might have a spirit. My parents and sister, whose rooms were on the second floor, had various experiences, especially hearing footsteps on the stairs at night. My sister recalls sitting in her room and feeling someone tap her on the shoulder. She turned around to see who it was, but there was no one there. There were many small experiences like that. One night, while alone again, my dad looked over and saw his deceased father, my grandfather, sitting next to him. My father says he didn't appear ghostly at all. He looked exactly as he did in life. Though he doesn't recall everything his father said, my dad remembers that he was going through some difficult times, and my grandfather reassured him he would be okay. Then as quickly as he appeared, he was gone. The general feeling was that the spirits weren't malevolent, but they occasionally liked to remind us that we were sharing the same space. Behind that house was a double garage that had been converted into a small guest house which we called the cottage. The paranormal activity in that building, however, was on an entirely different level. The cottage is where my father and I kept our musical instruments, a place where we would often go and jam together. It was mostly a large, open single room, with a loft for sleeping and a small bathroom to the side. By this time I was a young adult, so I'd stay there during the summer when I was home from college. My experiences were mostly just a feeling of being watched, and sometimes I'd wake up in the middle of the night with the intense sensation that if I looked down from the loft, I'd see something in the room. So I did what any self-respecting wuss would do. I hid under the covers instead. One night as I was walking from the main house to the cottage, I noticed the bathroom light was on through an outside window. I saw a silhouette of someone moving around, their shadows cast on the closed blinds of the bathroom. This wasn't a big deal. My parents and other family members could sometimes come and go as they pleased, as the cottage was basically our social area. When I walked in, the bathroom door was closed, and I patiently waited for the person to come and see who it was. I waited and waited, but no one exited and the door remained closed. At this point, I began to wonder if something was wrong, so I knocked on the bathroom door and asked, "Hello? Did you fall in?" Complete silence. Was my dad in there having a heart attack? It's not like someone could have just exited without me noticing or hearing the door open. I jiggled the knob and pushed. It was unlocked. There was no one inside. Later, when my dad was still working nights, I was away at college, and he was alone in the cottage playing our Fender Rhodes piano, passing some time before he had to leave for work, when suddenly he heard a woman's voice behind him say, "Should we show him, or should we tell him?" The hair on his neck immediately stood up. He turned and saw, hovering over the sofa, a whitish-grey cloud of smoke just a few feet away. The top and bottom of the smoke was like a tabletop, and only the sides had that smoky character, but it was completely still. With the exit across the room, my dad stood up, determined to move past the sofa to survey the room. He moved his hands just over the smoke to see if it could move, and to verify if what he was seeing was real. But it didn't react to him at all. After moving across the room, he demanded in a shaky voice, "If you're really here, then beat on the floor." He felt two very loud, hard knocks directly under his feet. The knocks were so hard they nearly pushed him off the floor, even though the cottage was built directly on top of a concrete slab. He looked back up, realizing the cloud had disappeared, but something else caught his eye. Sitting on the floor near the alley door was a glowing ball. It was between the size of a basketball and a beach ball. The outside was black, burned and jagged, with ragged holes in places that allowed him to see inside. He described the luminous interior as similar to a campfire after it burnt down, like glowing embers yet intensely red in color. He examined it for a few seconds and then watched as the ball floated up towards the loft. The air was electric, and he knew something big was about to happen. With his heart pounding out of his chest and every nerve tingling, he couldn't bear it any longer and sprinted outside, leaving the cottage's front door wide open. He stood in the yard for a moment, breathing heavily as he collected his nerves. After regaining his composure, he went back inside, but everything was still, and he knew whatever was there had gone. He never experienced anything like that again, and his only regret is that he didn't stay, because he still wonders what they wanted to communicate with him. Now all I can tell you is that my dad has been telling this story in the exact same way for 20 years, without changing a single detail. So make that of it what you will. Eventually my parents moved back to Dayton, this time into a beautiful stone home. Their new home sat atop a hill with a large deck offering a dramatic view of downtown Cincinnati. The property had good privacy and was surrounded by woods. Nothing strange ever happened inside that house, but outside my dad would sometimes see human-like shadows darting around the yard at night. The way he described them sounds similar to how shadow people are usually described in internet lore. Now it's easy to explain these away as tricks of the mind in the dark, but he says one actually got close enough to speak with him. One autumn night, while he was relaxing on the deck enjoying the crisp air, he heard a disembodied voice in the darkness simply say, "You're gonna get some money." He found it strange, but certainly intriguing, and a month later my dad won $200,000 in the Kentucky Powerball lottery. I know this might sound like the most outlandish part of it all, but it's completely true. In 2012, my parents bought their current home in a different town. They've lived there for over a decade now, and have never experienced anything paranormal. I also own my own home and have never seen, heard, or experienced anything in the 7 years I've been here. And that's it. Whenever our family shares ghost stories, these are the ones we tell. I thought it'd be fun to save them for posterity, and hope that you enjoyed. I do have a bonus story though. The last story might not qualify as a ghost story, but I think it's still worth sharing nonetheless. When I was a teenager in the late 90s, I heard about a technique to supposedly talk to your guardian angel. The idea was to sit somewhere quiet with pencil and paper and ask a question. Empty your mind and just let your hand write. Don't think, just write. It didn't work too well for me. I struggled to clear my mind and mostly ended up writing gibberish. The only real answer I got when I supposedly asked my guardian angel for its name was Sarah Elizabeth. I was puzzled. Is it Sarah or Elizabeth? Later, I mentioned my experiment in passing to my grandmother, and she immediately went pale. She told me that between my mother and my aunt, she'd had a miscarriage, and the baby's name was going to be Sarah Elizabeth. I was stunned that this was a family secret that I had never heard. Back in the 90s, it was especially uncommon to publicly discuss miscarriages, especially around teenage boys. Out of all the possible name combinations I could have imagined, I wonder if that was just a coincidence or not. Either way, it certainly was a spooky one. I had just turned 40. Life was good, or so I thought. I was in the best shape of my life, working out 5 times a week, eating clean and keeping busy with my work as a hairstylist. My schedule was insane, but I thrived on the chaos. Looking back, I realized my body had been whispering warnings to me for years. The signs were there. For the past 5 years, strange things kept happening, things I brushed off as stress or overwork. A sudden flash fever that would hit and vanish in moments, chronic low-grade headaches that came and went, random bouts of dizziness, and this deep, bone-crushing fatigue that never seemed to go away. I always told myself I was just pushing too hard. I had clients, deadlines, life. Who had time to slow down? But then the auras started. They came out of nowhere, weird, shimmering lights in my vision like glitches in the Matrix. At first they were rare, almost dreamlike, but they kept on coming, and I still ignored it. Until I couldn't anymore. It was early September 2010. I remember that morning like it happened yesterday. I woke up feeling off, my body was heavy, my limbs like lead. I swung my legs over the side of the bed, but before I could stand, a wave of dizziness hit me so hard I had to sit down. My heart pounded in my ears as I tried to catch my breath, and I told myself I just needed a minute. But deep down I knew something was wrong. Still, I powered through. I forced myself up and got ready to go to work, packed my lunch and grabbed my computer. My partner was driving me to work that day, thank God. I was too shaky to drive. But I never made it. We were about halfway there when it happened. I passed out once, and again. My partner panicked. I came to just long enough to see the fear in his eyes as he made the sharp turn towards the nearest hospital. By the time we reached the emergency room, my heart was racing so fast it felt like I was about to explode. I was lightheaded, barely hanging on, and didn't realize until later that my skin had gone ashen grey. They admitted me immediately. I was taken to an exam room while my partner left to run errands, and that's when things got strange. I was lying on the hospital bed trying to stay calm, but my mind was spinning. Time passed, how much I couldn't tell. Then the door opened and a doctor walked in. He was around 5'9", mid-40s, but his glasses stood out the most, large, gold-rimmed, and gleaming like something straight out of the 70s. They were too shiny, almost unnatural. Even in my weakened state, I noticed it was weird, like those glasses didn't belong to this time. But despite the oddness of it, I wasn't afraid. His presence was calming. He didn't say much, just examined me with those ice-cold hands that sent a chill through my body. His touch felt different, too cold, but his voice was soothing when he finally spoke. "Don't worry. Everything will be okay." There was a certainty to his words that I felt deep in my bones. He left the room after that, and I never saw him again. I was admitted to the hospital for 2 months. The dizziness, the fatigue, and heart issues were just the tip of the iceberg. Eventually, they found out the cause. Stage 4, B-cell lymphoma. A rare form of cancer that only 2% of people diagnosed survive. I was in stage 4, i.e., no going back. The oncologist didn't sugarcoat it. They started me on chemo right away, but by late December, after 3 rounds, the tumors in my abdomen weren't shrinking. The doctors had grim news. They needed to ramp up chemo, aggressively, higher doses, stronger meds. But it came with a cost. The first treatment stole everything. I lost all feeling in my hands, legs, and arms. I couldn't walk without assistance. They told me I would never do hair again, and they told me if this was more aggressive and chemo didn't work, I had a month to live. I was going to die, and I accepted it. I don't know how to describe what happened next. I had what some would call a spiritual awakening. I made peace with my fate. But somewhere deep down, I knew I wasn't going to die. Within a week of starting the new chemo, something impossible happened. The tumors in my abdomen just vanished. The doctors couldn't explain it, but I could, because I remembered. Before being transferred for a bone marrow transplant, I wanted to thank the staff who had taken care of me. But there was one person I had to see. The doctor, the one with the gold glasses who told me I'd be okay. I asked the head nurse if I could speak with him, and she gave me a puzzled look. "What doctor?" she asked, tilting her head. I described him, his height, his age, the glasses, the impossible shiny glasses. Honey, there's no one like that works here. I've been here 30 years, I know everyone. And no one like that has ever worked in the ER. My heart stopped. I wasn't crazy, I had felt his hands, I had heard his voice. He was there. But he wasn't. Was he an angel, a spirit, a ghost? I don't know, but he was real, and I knew deep in my soul that his words carried power. You'll be okay. I held on to those words through every grueling round of chemo, through the pain, the fear, the despair. And somehow, I survived. The bone marrow transplant was a success. Against all odds, I beat stage 4 lymphoma. My hands and legs, useless after the aggressive chemo, managed to heal. The doctor said I'd never walk again, but now I'm not only walking, I'm back to doing hair. I shouldn't be here, but I am. And I know why. It's because of him. I've tried to explain it, I've tried to rationalize it, but I can't. And I don't need to. I know what happened. And I know that someone was watching over me that day. I beat the odds. I'm alive. And I'll never forget the man who told me I'll be okay. The man who to most people was never there. People say there's a little girl in the laboratory where I work in Querétaro. I've heard the stories countless times. Whispers exchanged during late shifts, murmured conversations among co-workers over coffee. They talk about feeling her presence. They say she's watching. But I've never seen her, not with my own eyes. The ones who have? It's always the cleaning staff, the ones who come in before dawn, when the air is heavy with silence, or the media team who shows up early to set up their equipment. They've seen her. A little girl standing near the window or peeking out from behind the rows of equipment. Sometimes they might hear a faint giggle echoing through the empty hallways. I thought it was all nonsense until one quiet Sunday. It was almost too quiet. I was in the lab with a co-worker processing samples. Our system was simple. Samples are passed to us through a transparent window, and you can see everything clear on the other side. And every time someone delivers a sample, they knock on the glass. That day we were sitting near the window waiting, and that's when we heard it. 3 knocks, loud and forceful. It wasn't the light tap from a co-worker. This was more insistent. We both turned towards the window to see nothing, but we could still see the glass moving slightly, vibrating, as if someone had hit it hard. But when we looked closer to look through the window, there was no one there. I tried to laugh it off. Must be the wind, I joked. But the lab is airtight and sterile. No wind comes in or out unless it's controlled. Then the knock came again, louder this time, and a chill ran down my spine. I decided to check. I walked the perimeter of the lab, peeking into the hallways, checking every corner. But there was no one. I asked another co-worker if they had knocked, and they looked at me like I was crazy. I even joked that maybe the office girls were messing with us. But then I remembered it was Sunday. The office staff weren't even in. Later that day, I was alone in the lab. My co-worker had left, and I was finishing up some samples near the window. And that's when I heard a whisper right behind me. Shh. My blood went cold. I spun around, but the room was empty, but I felt it. I've never been one to believe in ghosts, but now my mind was starting to sway. Later, I was at my friend's birthday, and he asked if I could host the party at my place. I didn't mind. I had a decent living room, plenty of space for his friends, and one of his guests was a woman I didn't know. She was quite reserved, kept to herself, but there was something about her that felt off. At one point she asked to use the bathroom. I told her it was right down the hall and to the right. When she came back, she didn't say much, but I noticed her whispering something to her friend. He glanced at me with this weird look, like he had just heard something obscene. I didn't press him about it. But several months later after the party, me and that friend had had a few too many drinks, and my friend finally told me what she had said. She saw something, he muttered, almost too embarrassed to admit it, and I pressed him for more. She says there's someone in the hallway. A woman. Curiosity got the better of me. A bit later, I was messing around with one of those anime filters on TikTok, the kind that turn your photos into anime-style images, and I decided to take a photo of the hallway. When the filter processed the image, there was a woman. Faint, blurred, and unmistakable. That same week, some weird things started happening. I kept feeling like there was a thread tied around my ring finger. At first, I brushed it off as my imagination, but the sensation wouldn't go away. It was tight, almost as if something was pulling at me. It became so real I started scratching at my finger, trying to loosen whatever was there. Out of curiosity, I used the TikTok filter again, this time to video my hand, and it appeared to be a brown thread wrapped tightly around my finger, visible only in the filter. It wasn't the only strange thing. One afternoon I went to the corner store. When I came back, I tossed my keys onto the bed like I always do. I was home all day after that. There was no reason for me to touch the keys. And hours later, when I went to lock the front door, there were two identical keys. One was loose, but the other was the exact same. I tested it and it worked. Where the hell did this other key come from? A friend of mine suggested something, that perhaps my house has a portal to beyond. I didn't laugh, because after everything I've seen and felt, maybe he's right. When I was around 5 or 6, I strongly believed that I was met with a ghost in my own house. One night when I was watching TV in my living room on the couch, I got distracted by a rocking chair moving back and forth. That was odd. The windows were open, but there was no wind, and it was the fall season, so we didn't need to put on the AC. It was a little off, but I figured that it had rocked back and forth because it was just a really old rocking chair. It stopped rocking a minute later and didn't move again. The next night when I was watching TV, I heard a cup fall to the ground from the shelf. Something wasn't right now. Why would it just fall like that? I thought it was probably just a draft, so I walked over to the kitchen area, which was right next to the living room, and I picked up the cup off the floor and placed it back to where it was. Nothing happened again that next night, or the next. But the night after I was watching TV, when out of the blue, a radio set which was on a desk right next to me turned on. This was no draft. A radio can't just turn on by itself. It would only turn on if someone did it manually. It was at this point I started crying. I ran to my parents' room while I heard the radio still playing. I barged right in to see my mum on the phone with someone. I heard her say to whoever she was on the phone to, "Hold on just a second." She asked me what the matter was, and I exclaimed that the radio just turned on out of nowhere, and I believe the ghost did it. She rolled her eyes and sighed and said, "Come walk with me." So we went together to the living room. When I got back to the living room, the radio was now turned off. My mum then told me, "See, there's no such thing as ghosts." I told her that I was being for real, but she didn't buy it. She walked back to her room and carried on her conversation where she left off. No sudden movements ever happened again, but I was so scared to go into that living room for a while. I eventually faced my fears later on, but it always stuck with me. I know most people don't believe in the paranormal, but I firmly believe that a ghost was in my house, back when I was only just a child. When I was around 5, I used to wake up in the middle of the night and see a figure floating in the hallway between my room and my mother's. She was always the same, a brunette with curly hair, dressed in a flowing white robe. At first I brushed it off, thinking it was just lights from the street outside, bending in weird ways. But it kept happening, even on the darkest nights. Every time I saw her, I'd panic, call for my mum, and the moment the light flicked on, she was gone. My mum told me not to be afraid, that this ghost was my angel, and suggested I try talking to her. One night I worked up the courage and whispered into the darkness, "Who are you?" What happens next still haunts me. The calm, almost serene presence shifted. Beneath her, the floor glowed red, like embers from a dying fire. Her face remained unchanged, but there was something darker, something wrong. And then she vanished, leaving behind her way too many questions that I can never answer, especially because I never saw her again. It was around Easter, and I was asleep in bed with my mum, something I often did, as the dark terrified me. My cat was curled up at the foot of the bed when I heard footsteps in the hallway. I sat up, trying to shake the sleep from my eyes, and I noticed my cat's ears were perked up, her gaze locked on the hallway. Then we saw it. A tall figure stood just outside the room. Its eyes glowed a sickly yellow in the dark, and its ears were pointed like something out of a nightmare. It stared at me unmoving, like it was trying to figure out where I was. My blood turned cold, but I wasn't the only one who noticed. My cat, who's usually a sweetheart, was on her feet, fur puffed out, back arched, ready to fight. Her eyes flashed yellow for a moment, just like that. Things. The creature stared at her, then at me, then it faded, disappearing into the same spot where the woman in white had always appeared. As I got older, the line between dreams and reality grew thinner still. I started having what I can only describe as astral plane sequences. One of the earliest was at my dad's house. I woke up to finding myself standing in the driveway watching my uncle work on his Firebird. I was just there watching him, feeling the cold air, smelling the oil. I knew I wasn't awake, but it felt too real to be a dream. That feeling, like my eyes were closed and open at the same time, became familiar, and I learnt to associate it with something coming. One of my most terrifying experiences happened at my babysitter's house. I was napping on her couch one summer afternoon when I slipped into another astral sequence. I woke up to see her sitting in her chair, her husband across from her, and me, still asleep on the couch. But that wasn't the worst part. Standing between the two chairs was me, a doppelganger. I don't know why, but I charged at it, and that was a mistake. It wrestled me. I could feel its nails, its strength. It wasn't just a dream. I felt the pain, and then it was gone. But it wasn't. Even now, every once in a while, when I drift into that in-between state, I'm sure I can feel it still. Years later, in a different house, I gave my ex a bear that we used to pass back and forth. She liked it because it smelt like me, but I swear that bear wasn't normal. We both woke up multiple times to the damn thing moving on its own. And I appreciate how crazy that sounds. One time I tried to cleanse it, thinking maybe whatever was attached to it would leave. But the moment I tried, the air grew heavy. I felt a deep, almost primal dread wash over me, and I could feel something in the room, watching, waiting. We decided it was best to just leave it alone. Whatever was in the bear had no interest in leaving. The house I live in now was haunted. There's something that runs up and down the stairs at night, heavy footsteps. Sometimes I'll walk through the hallway. My ex experienced it firsthand while doing her makeup in the mirror one evening. I was in the shower, and she screamed when she heard the stomping behind her. "Something stomped past you?" I casually asked when I got out. "Yeah." She was still shaking. "Oh, that's just the spirit. He's harmless." One night, I woke up at 2 a.m. to the sound of my VCR rejecting a tape. I groggily turned over and saw a figure crouched by it. I thought it was my mum, but it wasn't. The damn thing hissed at me, and I instinctively threw myself against the wall to get as far away from it as possible. and it faded right after, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. And then came the writing. White words appeared on the wall behind me, along with a face pushing out from the shadows behind the shelf. TV on, problem solved. It happened again recently, but this time it wasn't a face, it was a whole person. And it left me with the same feeling of dread. This is my collection of weird things that have happened to me throughout my life. I know many of you will just dismiss it as nonsense, but it's my life and they're my real experiences, and I really don't wish them upon anyone. I had a friend called Nova. He was that super cool spiritual guy who seemed like he belonged to another time. He was in his early 20s, but his soul felt ancient. He was the type who believed in magic, in energy shaping reality, and in the power of will to change the world. Me? I was raised Catholic and agnostic by default, skeptical of anything I couldn't touch or see. But Nova? He cracked my world wide open. We clicked instantly, like we had always known each other. We were inseparable, more like brothers than friends. His family knew me well, even though I'd never met them. He was always at my place in Jersey, though he lived deep in Queens. He was home to me. He was also a hell of a dancer. I mean, the man moved like liquid on the floor, a master of flow who could make any beat his own. He was my inspiration to start shuffling. I was trash at first, but Nova was patient, guiding me every step of the way. He had this gift, not just for dancing, but for seeing people. He noticed the cracks in me, the trauma I carried from childhood, and he wanted to help me heal. That's when he suggested we drop L together. I'd never tried psychedelics before. I'd heard about them, sure, but Nova believed they were more than just a trip. A tool for growth, to peel back the layers of reality. His theories were wild, but in a way they made sense. And that's when everything took a turn. It was November of 2016. We were tripping in my apartment, laughing at nothing and everything, when the conversation drifted into strange territory. Nova asks, "Hey man, what would you do if I died?" It hit me like a punch to the gut, caught completely off guard, and I blurted out the first thing that popped into my head. "I'd haunt you." Nova laughed, his wide, mischievous grin. "Well, I'd come back as your cat," he said without any hesitation, his eyes twinkling like he was already on some cosmic joke. "A cat? I can't even have a dog in this apartment. That's why a cat," he shrugged, like it was the most obvious thing in the world. We kept joking, and I told him that if he did come back, he'd have to be an orange cat. I'd always wanted one like Garfield, smart, independent, and full of character. We laughed about it, sealed it with a handshake, and then the moment was over. We carried on with our day, other conversations ensued, and I didn't think about that conversation again until the following year. Fast forward to January of 2017. My birthday was coming up on February 3rd, and Nova and I had plans to hit up a club where I was getting free drinks for bringing 10 friends. We had even made plans for me to pick up a mutual friend from Pennsylvania and drive her back the next day. But life had other plans. Nova had loaned me some stuff and was counting on me to cover him with money that I was expecting from a refund. The disbursement dragged, tensions rose, and by the time February rolled around, we weren't speaking. We fought, and I was pissed. He skipped my birthday, and someone else picked up our mutual friend, and they went about their night. Midnight, I'm at the club, buzzed and ignoring his last text asking for an update on the money. I didn't reply, but I didn't know it would be the last message he'd ever send me. The next morning, I wake up to a nightmare. Texts, missed calls, something about a car accident and Nova missing. The arsehole driver he'd asked to take our friend home had gone 140 in a 40, hit the divider, flipped, rolled, all of them gone. Just like that. And it was my fault. At least that's how it felt. I should have answered. I should have made things right. If I'd have picked her up, if I'd have just replied, maybe they'd still be here. I spiraled hard. I was failing college, drowning in guilt, barely functioning. Nova was more than a friend. He was my twin flame, one of the only people I'd ever truly connected with. Without him, I felt hollow. At his funeral, I finally met his family. His mum. God, she could see the wreck in me. And she handed me an envelope filled with his ashes. "He'd want you to have these," she said softly. I bought a Tree of Life necklace and stored some of his ashes in it, wearing it close to my heart. It was a small comfort, but the emptiness didn't go away. Weeks passed and I was still drowning. And that's when the single weirdest thing happened. My sister called me one afternoon. Nova and my sister had been close, they'd met through me, and even though they had a friends with benefits thing for a while, she lived just around the corner and we hung out often. "Bro," she said, her tone a little off, I need a favor. There's this cat. It's been hanging around my place for a few days, meowing like crazy, and it just won't leave. Rex is gonna kill it," referring to her psycho pit bull. "Can you come get it before something happens?" I didn't think twice. I walked over and stepped inside, and she mentioned something weird. "I gave him a bath, he let me." What? A stray cat let you bathe it? That didn't make sense. And then she opened the door. Out strolled a 6-month-old orange tabby. My heart stopped. The second we locked eyes, I knew, and I swear to God the cat knew too. I dropped to my knees, my body shaking, tears streaming down my face. It was Nova. My sister freaked out, asked what the hell was going on, but I just scooped him up and held him close and whispered through my tears, "It's Nova. He's back." Of course she didn't believe me at first. Not until I told her about our promise, about the joke we made that day about coming back as an orange cat. She was skeptical. But then Nova lifted his paw and placed it gently on my necklace, the one holding his ashes, and he stared into my eyes with an intensity that pierced my soul. My sister screamed. I didn't. I just knew. Life went back to normal after that. Well, as normal as it can be. Nova Cat became part of my life, helping me heal in ways I can't even explain. It was like he had never left. He knew exactly how to be there for me just like before. My entire perspective on reality shifted. I stopped questioning what I couldn't see because now I've lived it. You don't have to believe me. I wouldn't blame you if you didn't. But I know what I saw, and I know what I felt. Nova kept his promise. And for now, I won't be alone. This happened late one night at my aunt's house. The rain tapped softly against the windows, and the house was quiet except for the distant hum of the refrigerator. My siblings, cousin, and I were all in the spare room talking and laughing, when my aunt suddenly appeared in the doorway. "Can one of you turn off the garage light?" she asked. The request was simple, but something about it made my stomach twist. Maybe it was just the time of night, or maybe it was the way the house felt. My older brother shrugged off the task, insisting that I go with my younger sister. We stepped into the hallway where the dim glow from the kitchen barely cut through the darkness. The house felt colder than before. The air carried a strange weight to it, as if something unseen was pressing in around us. When we reached the garage, the door was already cracked open slightly. The light was still on, and I took a breath, pushed it in fully and stepped inside. Nothing seemed out of place, just storage boxes, shelves, and my aunt's car parked neatly in the back. I reached for the switch, flipping it off. Instant darkness. And that's when I saw it. A tall figure, standing just beside the door within reach. It hadn't been there when the light was on, but now in the pitch black it was undeniable. A solid shape of pure darkness, darker than the dark itself. It had no details, but was just a void in the shape of a person. At first I thought my eyes were adjusting. Maybe it was my mind playing tricks on me, trying to see shapes where there clearly weren't any. But it didn't fade. It didn't move. It was just there, close enough to touch. I couldn't breathe. My entire body was locked up in paralyzing fear, and I felt like it was toying with me, like it wanted me to react. Then finally instinct kicked in. I bolted. My sister was right behind me as we ran full speed back into the house, leaving the garage door wide open. Back in the room, my cousins and brother looked at us confused. We tried to explain breathlessly and shaking, but they laughed it off. "You're just afraid of the dark." But it wasn't the dark that terrified me. It was what was standing within it. That night, neither of us slept. We lay awake staring at the bedroom door, waiting for something to happen. But nothing did. I'm glad my aunt moved out of that house. They never believed us, but honestly I don't blame them. If someone had told me what we saw that night, I wouldn't have believed them either. When I was around 10 years old, I was sleeping over at my grandparents' house. It was a small, cozy place that always smelled like old books and homemade bread. I'd spent so many nights there, but this one was different. I don't know why I woke up. Maybe it was just one of those times when your body senses something before your mind catches on, and I lay there in the stillness, staring up at the ceiling, trying to will myself back to sleep, until I heard it. A scratching noise, coming from the back of the house near the window. At first, I thought maybe it was just trees brushing up against the glass. But that didn't make sense. There was a porch back there. Nothing could have reached the window. I sat up a little, ears straining, heart pounding just a little faster, and the scratching stopped. I held my breath, hoping that was the end of it, hoping to be able to dismiss the whole thing and be able to roll back over to sleep. But then the footsteps came. They were faint at first, a soft, deliberate thudding that echoed through the floor, coming from the cellar, of all places. I froze. Had someone broken in? Maybe those scratching noises had something to do with it. But something didn't feel right. I didn't move, I didn't call out. I simply listened. The footsteps stopped, and relief washed over me, but it didn't last long. A few minutes later I heard them again, only this time they were upstairs on the second floor. Now panic started to creep in. My grandparents were asleep down the hall, completely unaware. And me? I was lying there paralyzed, listening to something move around the house that shouldn't have been there. The footsteps stopped again. For a moment the silence was so heavy I thought maybe I had imagined the whole thing. But then it started again. Only now, they appeared to be coming straight for me. My blood ran cold. The footsteps were slow and deliberate. I couldn't see anything, but I could feel it. Something was approaching. I kept telling myself it was time to scream, or run, or just move, but I couldn't. I was frozen in place, wide-eyed, staring at the door, waiting to see whatever was coming for me. But there was nothing. No shadows, no figures. Just footsteps. I threw the blanket over my head, squeezing my eyes shut. If I couldn't see it, maybe you couldn't see me. I told myself to just go to sleep and it would be all over. But sleep wouldn't come. And then the chain rattled. My heart stopped. The neighbors had a dog they let out at night, and I could sometimes hear him running around the yard with his chains rattling as he moved. But this sound wasn't in the next door garden. It was right next to me. The sound was so close, like a chain hanging in the air right beside my ear. My breath caught. I didn't move. I couldn't. I stayed hidden under the covers, gripping them so tight my knuckles ached. The sound of the chain was impossibly close. I could feel the cold metal practically brushing against my skin, and yet there was no one there. I don't know how long I stayed like that, too scared to move, too terrified to even breathe. I must have been under there for hours. And somehow, throughout the fear, I managed to will myself asleep. Be it that or exhaustion, take your pick. When I woke up in the morning, the sunlight streamed through the window like nothing had happened. but I knew it wasn't a dream. A few days later, I told my mum about it, expecting her to laugh it off and tell me I was imagining things. But the look in her eyes said otherwise. Recognition. You see, she grew up in that house, and as it turns out, she'd had similar things happen when she was younger. I never slept over at my grandparents' house again after that, and honestly, I don't think I want to know what was really walking around that night. My best friend took his own life. I didn't find out for 5 days. 5 whole days. But the day before I heard, I was sitting in the living room with my husband, and out of the corner of my eye, I saw something. I told my husband not to move, but just look right by the wall. There was a shadow. A man not too tall, not too short, not fat, not thin, just standing there watching. My husband, who rarely believed this stuff, agreed. It wasn't ominous. We got up afterwards and stood in the spot the shadow had been in, and the floor seemed to be vibrating. That was it. The next day I found out about my friend's passing, and I was convinced it was him who had visited us. But also that evening, after finding out, I was crying and sobbing and angry and upset, and talking to my friend saying, "Why didn't you just call me? Was I not a good friend? How could you think you had none? Was I nothing to you?" I know, that was stupid. His death wasn't about me, etc. But if you've lost a close friend or family member to them taking their own life, it's hard to stay sensible. Anyway, I woke up the next morning but stayed in bed, sad, depressed, and picked up my phone as I automatically do, checked my emails, and there was an email from the Wayfair with a picture of a painting. Title of the painting? Most Devoted Ghost. I thought I would get more signs from him for the rest of my life, or even just for a while, but that was it. I don't know what's going on over there in the afterlife, but I felt then that there was at least some curtain between life and afterlife, albeit for a short while anyway. When I was around 11, I was really into horror, creepy, and weird stuff. Back then, I was also very religious and believed in God and angels, but I've since become more skeptical. However, there are 3 strange encounters from my childhood that I've never been able to explain. 1 visual, 1 auditory, and 1 physical. One night, my parents went out to a party, leaving me alone with my toddler brother. We were in the living room watching TV when out of nowhere I saw a white, faceless, bodiless figure floating from the kitchen towards the basement. It didn't have any clear features, just this pale, ghostly form. The weirdest part, I wasn't as terrified as I thought I'd be if I ever saw a ghost. I just froze completely in shock, watching it disappear. The auditory encounter happened at 3 a.m., and I was still awake when I suddenly heard a middle-aged woman crying outside my window. Now here's the thing, this wasn't in an apartment building where someone could be standing outside. I grew up in Iceland, and my childhood home is in an area that might have once been Viking grounds. The sound was clear, like she was right outside, but when I looked out the window there was nothing, no footsteps in the snow, no wind carrying the sound, just silence. Another time at around 3 a.m., I woke up to 3 distinct knocks coming from the desk under my bed. I had a bunk bed with a desk built underneath, so whatever knocked was coming from directly beneath me. As I lay there frozen in fear, my entire bed suddenly started shaking. I was terrified, and then I passed out. I don't remember falling asleep or calming down. It was just terror, then blackness. These experiences still stick with me, and I'd love to hear what you guys think. Sleep paralysis? A hypnagogic hallucination? Or something more? Anyone have any similar experiences they'd care to share? I'm all ears. Hey guys, it's Mort here. Thank you so much for listening. I hope you enjoyed tonight's ghost stories. I certainly did. And you can let me know down below what you thought. But I'd like to thank everyone for tuning in tonight, especially my members and patrons whose names can be seen on screen. If you enjoyed, be sure to let me know. I have this funny idea for April Fools. I think it falls on a Tuesday. So, you know, it's going to be silly. But if you want to join me for that video, feel free. Alright then, I might even do it live. Take care guys. See you in the next one. Good night.